Our second keynote speaker is going to talk to us about Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka. And I'm sure all of us were shocked and stunned by the horrendous attack that took place recently in Sri Lanka, and perhaps we're all the more eager to try and understand some of the complexities of what's going on in this island country, which is often described as paradise on earth. So we are very fortunate to have our speaker, Professor Jonathan Spencer, who is Regius Professor of South Asian Languages, Culture and Society at the School of Society and Political Science, University of Edinburgh in the UK. We're lucky to have him because he has been a long-time observer and researcher and writer on Sri Lanka. If I got it correctly, his early field work dates back to the early 1980s. He's an anthropologist, so he gives us a unique perspective from the inside, but not just that, because he also takes on politics, which I'll come to in a moment. So his writing has given us a perspective both on pre-conflict Sri Lanka, conflict Sri Lanka, and post-conflict Sri Lanka. He's written numerous books and articles, many of them acclaimed. I won't go through the whole list of them, you can easily look that up. But one very interesting piece, a book in 2014, was a collaborative ethnography of war and peace, looking at all the different religious communities in Sri Lanka. You'll also notice the title in the program was Buddhist Nationalism, but I think it's become even more pertinent for all of us to engage with the topic of some things we might not know about religious conflict in Sri Lanka. And just here on a personal note, I would say that as a political scientist, I've truly enjoyed reading his writings as an anthropologist because they've spoken to me as a political scientist, because he's taken on politics. He gives us a perspective of what politics means to the individual, whereas maybe us as political scientists tend to overlook the role and the importance of the individual. But he hasn't only just focused on the individual, he's looked at institutions and how institutions, especially those democratic institutions that most of us value and treasure, but actually sometimes produce unintended and rather horrific consequences. And here I'd like to alert you to a particularly fascinating piece published in Third World Quarterly in 2008 called A Nationalism Without Politics, the Illiberal Consequences of Liberal Institutions in Sri Lanka. We also have in the audience Professor Shribata Mitra, who's long written on liberal and illiberal politics in India, so I look forward to a vibrant discussion between the two of them following the talk. Now, the subject of religion, culture, politics is of course pertinent and of interest to the whole of South Asia. And Professor Jonathan Spencer, I think recently is looking more and more at comparative studies between South Asian countries. But just thinking about what I was going to say today, it struck me that Sri Lanka's experience is of particular resonance to Ireland. The two are sort of comparable in size as islands. Perhaps they both suffer the same problem of being insular and yet being very open to the world. They've both dealt with sectarian conflict, have very close experience with it. And I think, of course, they both experienced this phenomena of the pangs of proximity, too close to the UK, too close to India, and yet, of course, benefiting from that relationship as well. And finally, another interesting parallel that I found is that Ireland is, of course, casting its identity towards Europe, and Sri Lanka is casting its identity in terms of the Indian Ocean. So you have that sort of pan outlook, but that both these island countries are trying to engage in. So therefore, with great pleasure, I hand you over to Professor Jonathan Spencer and look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very kind and very well-informed introduction. And thank you to everybody who's responsible for the invitation and for the wonderfully warm hospitality I've experienced. If indeed if the hospitality maintains last night's level, I might actually pass away by Friday. So keep our fingers crossed on that. The Ireland point is a good one. I was walking around this morning past the Parnell Memorial, and when I decided to reconstruct what I was going to say today in the light of the events of last weekend, I thought for a minute, let's go the full W.B. Yeats and just call this Easter 2019, and then I thought maybe not. Maybe nothing beautiful has happened out of the events of last Sunday, so it's just hinted in the title. Everything that follows. I'll try to get through my own prepared part of this as quickly as I can, on the assumption that people will have questions, particularly about the kind of story of last weekend and what we know about that. And so I'm very happy to answer those questions, and I make no promises, though, about making sense of things. And that's indeed going to be one part of what I'm going to tell you. I was originally going to talk about Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, and again, if you feel shortchanged that there's not enough Buddhist nationalism in the reconstructed paper, just put your hands up at the end, and I can tell you more and say more. The picture there was taken by my friend Alan Keenan, who's a senior researcher at the International Crisis Group. It's a Buddhist stupa somewhere on the road to Jaffna in 2009, with these handy little model soldiers outside, signifying the tight embrace between the state of Sri Lanka and the institution of Buddhism. I'll talk a little bit about Buddhist nationalisms in the context of the Civil War, and particularly in the years since the end of the Civil War in 2009. We're just coming up to the 10-year anniversary now, and I think all the thoughts we had about taking stock of that 10-year period have been thrown into disarray by the events of the last few days. I'll talk a bit more about religious diversity, drawing in part on the work in the 2014 book I did with my other colleagues in Sri Lanka. And I'll talk somewhat about, actually relative length, about the position of the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka and how they've responded in the years of conflict, in the years since the conflict. And then I'll move on to Sunday's events and what we know about them and afterwards. And one of the central, probably the single most important point I'll be making today, and I've been making it repeatedly throughout the last few days to people who are interested, is the radical discontinuity between Sunday's events and everything that happened before. Nothing we know about conflict dynamics in Sri Lanka led anyone to expect what happened on Sunday and the way it happened. And to me it seems, although I know something about the antecedents, particularly of the Muslim group that has allegedly been mainly responsible for this, there is a kind of massive break in, if you like, political imagination that informs this act. This is not an act that is intelligible within what we know about conflict dynamics in Sri Lanka. But having said that, and this will be another of the points that I'll come back to at the end, having said that, although nothing we know about what happened before will tell us about why Sunday's events occurred, it will give us some idea about what might happen afterwards, because normal politics will resume in and around the aftermath of the event, and that's where the worries, I think, start to kick in. So this is just the remedial slide for people who don't know as much as I do about Sri Lanka. A population of about 20 million, 70% Buddhist, 13% Hindu, 10% Muslim. The religious, ethnic thing maps to some extent onto each other, so that Buddhists are all singular, but not all singular are Buddhists. Some are Christians, as we've all discovered in the last week. Hindus are indeed almost all Tamil, but not all Tamil speakers are Hindus, because the Muslim minority is predominantly Tamil speaking. But for complicated reasons to do with the politics of representation in the colonial era, Muslims have been treated as, in those days, a racially separate group, these days an ethnically separate group. And so there is considerable distance between Muslims and Tamils, although they share the same language. But the Christian minority, which has been most hard hit by the events of the last week, are almost equally similar in Tamil. The picture I took on a trip with my PhD student, Luke Heslop, in the town of Dambulla in 2010. And you can see a little Buddha statue nestled in amongst the deities in this very folksy, homemade Hindu koil in the town of Dambulla. And so in a sense it's a happy picture of coexistence, people worshipping each other's religious figures. The sad story behind it, though, is that a few months later that temple was torn down on the orders of the Buddhist priest in Dambulla as part of a complicated story where he was also trying to tear down the mosque. So the picture is rather loaded with significance. Okay, so the standard things that we all know about Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka and that dominated understanding when I first started to think and write about it in the early 1980s. I've taken a quote from the German Indologist Heinz Beckert, from a piece he had in Daedalus in the early 1970s. But, you know, which basically says Buddhist nationalism goes back to certainly the 6th century of the Common Era, probably longer. Something called nationalism, which unites the idea of the singular people with the Buddhist religion, is visible there, particularly in the Buddhist chronicle, the Mahavamsa. And so a lot of what we tried to do in the early 1980s, when the anti-Tamil violence led into civil war in the period between 1981 and 1984, the kind of first wave of critical work was trying to destabilize that particular narrative, for good or ill. That narrative was so ingrained in the literature, it went entirely unquestioned until the early 1980s. But by the early 80s, with the growth of Tamil militancy, Tamil pushback against Sinhalese Buddhist domination of the state, there were other kinds of reactions. I've just put this here. It's a poem by my friend Muhammad Numan, retired professor of Tamil who's a Muslim, but he's a retired professor of Tamil linguistics at Peradeniya University. It's a very well-known poem, written originally in Tamil. This is one of a number of translations that are available. The image in the background is the Jaffna Library from 1981, when forces associated with the government went on the rampage in Jaffna, killed quite a few people, and burned down the library. So the image of the burnt library is quite important. And the force of Newman's poem is that, in a sense, you have to kill the Buddha in order to be able to carry out these things done in the name of the Buddha. If the Buddha's teachings mean anything to you at all, then it makes no sense at all to be burning libraries and killing people in the name of Buddhist supremacy. I won't linger on that because I want to keep moving. I want to move on in particular to the events of Sunday. So 1983, major anti-Tamil violence. It was a pogrom organised by members of the then ruling party, the United National Party, in response to attacks by the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, in July 1983. This came right at the end of about 2 years when I'd been living in Sri Lanka. And all the time I'd been doing my fieldwork, I hadn't really thought that I was working on nationalism. I was an anthropologist. There was nothing you could call an anthropology of nationalism available in those days. I thought, well, you know, this is something I might have an opinion about as a human being, or as a kind of politically engaged human being, but it's not something I can have an academic opinion about because it happens on such a different scale from the scale on which I've been used to working. And then I kind of got off the plane and somebody thrust into my hands 3 books that were published in 1983, which were Imagined Communities, Ernest Gellner's Nations and Nationalism, and The Invention of Tradition. And I never looked back, really. One way and another, that provided the stimulus and the beginnings of an intellectual framework. And I realized that stuff that I had been seeing, doing very old-fashioned kind of village field work, could be seen as, if you like, nation-making. The production and reproduction of the nation was happening in front of me in terms of the things that these people in the village were doing. And the interaction of the ideology of the nation with the rough and tumble of everyday party politics became the major theme first of the PhD thesis I wrote, but also of the book that came out of that. And the Third World Quarterly article is like a late, refined version of the arguments I've been making for some time about all of this. So, as I say, the first wave of work on singular Buddhist nationalism took on the primordialist position. There was a very important critical essay by the Sri Lankan historian Leslie Gunawardena called The People of the Lyre, which really did put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of querying the standard understanding. Although Gunawardena's position was not, it was not the kind of crude one that is sometimes attributed to it. He was not saying this is all, for example, a colonial construct, as is an argument that's obviously familiar to those of you who know about writing about Hindu nationalism. He was saying that what we call Sinhala and what Sinhala meant to people actually was a different thing at different points in the past. You can see in the 18th century is different from the 14th century, is different from the 6th and 7th century. And Gunawardena had the background as a historian of ancient Sri Lanka to substantiate some part, at least, of his argument. But then there were back and forth, there were counter-arguments, there were polemics and counter-polemics. And by the mid-1990s, David Scott, who most of you will know as a post-colonial theorist, but David actually started as an ethnographer of Sri Lanka about this time. David had an intervention which memorably ended, so what? The bickering about which version of history counts or doesn't count is perhaps missing the point. And what we need to do is to shift our attention to other kinds of questions altogether. This is a sort of rather fruitless argument to engage in, and I have some sympathy for that position. Other work that was done through that first couple of decades, well, certainly the first decade after 1983, very important work on gendering the nation by Malati Dalvis and Chitralega Managuru, and also my friend Sumati Sivamohan, who was on the slide, but I seem to have edited her off by accident. Very important work by anthropologists, not just me, but James Brown, Michael Wist, and the late Serena Tenneco, looking at the ways in which nationalist ideology was produced and reproduced through schools, through development projects, and stuff like that. And the figure at the bottom, of course, is Prabhakaran, the leader of the LTTE, and the elephant in the room of these discussions is the lack of sustained critical attention to the idea of Tamil Eelam and the construction of the Tamil nation, but also the extraordinary political project of the LTTE, with its elaborate symbology. It's drawing on different kinds of bits and pieces of Tamil literature, contemporary stuff, and so on. Even now, we don't have anything like an adequate account of that movement and what motivated it. And so for me, actually, I was reminded this morning when I was thinking about the kind of unintelligibility of Sunday's acts, the impossibility of imagining how is it to be the sort of person tracking down the street with a backpack just about to blow up a bunch of kids coming out of Sunday school? And I remember having that same sense of unintelligibility around some of the acts of the LTTE, particularly, obviously, the use of suicide bombers. So it's worth just having that there as something to think about as well, to think about how poor a job we've done as scholars, as critical scholars, in terms of understanding Tamil nationalism. And there are reasons why that may have been the case, but even now it remains a gaping hole, certainly compared to the extensive literature on Buddhist nationalism. But to go back to Buddhist nationalism, by the way, just for the figure at the top, of course, is Mahinda Rajapaksa, the authoritarian president of Sri Lanka, with his people, as they say, rather strikingly photographed with a very large number of Buddhist monks. But to go back to Buddhist nationalism, and this one slide is everything I was going to say in today's talk before I got distracted by what happened at the weekend. So the Civil War lasted from 1983 to 2009. It ended comprehensively in May 2009 with the complete wipeout of the LTT and its senior leadership. So there's not been a peep in Sri Lanka itself of any kind of activity from the LTT, which is itself is very extraordinary. Very few conflicts of this sort end so comprehensively with the annihilation of the entire group that were fighting for, and which only a few years before had seemed so strong and so close, in fact, to fulfilling their political ambitions. So the government, the Sinhalese-dominated government, was engaged in a struggle against Tamil militancy from the mid-1970s onwards. And the shift from just militancy into civil war, it can be largely attributed to the cack-handed way in which the government dealt with the early struggles. In particular, the 1983 pogrom provided the militant groups with the recruits and the resources and the support and the backing which they'd never had before, which turned them into armies rather than just militant groups. It's a textbook case of how ill-conceived repression actually makes the situation much, much worse. And it's really important, obviously, that people bear this in mind as they try to imagine their way out of what's happened in the last week. Now, somewhere towards the middle period of the war, in the mid-1990s, mainstream singular nationalism started to change, certainly in terms of what it imagined the other was, what the enemy was. Although there was continued calls for a military solution to the ethnic conflict, particularly from well-placed and well-respected Buddhist monks, more and more of the emphasis was not being placed on Tamils or even on the LTTE, it was being placed on Christians. Christians became the new enemy, and particularly the activity of new evangelical churches, which it was claimed were unethically converting Buddhists by offering them various kinds of boons and bribes in order to convert. So this is why I've headed this slide, Just Disconnect. There's a way in which the concerns of the nationalist ideologues and the nationalist agitators start to diverge from what seemed to be the political imperatives at the moment. The political imperatives were the war. But for the nationalists, it was Christian churches and to some extent foreign NGOs and foreignness in general. And Christians stood for foreignness in general in all of this. This took the form of attacks on churches, this continuing campaign about unethical conversion, the creation of a new political party, the Jatkahela Urumea, in 2004 that stood in the elections and saw a number, I think it was 12, 14 Buddhist monks elected to parliament for the first time, which was a complete break with political practice in the past. These are members of the JHU having a bit of a disagreement on their way into Parliament in 2004. And you can see that for someone like me who's internalised many Sri Lankan expectations about the conduct and deportment of Buddhist monks, this sort of stuff strikes me as very, very transgressive. This is not how monks are supposed to behave. But for some monks, at least, this has become more normal. And so by the end of the war, it was quite routine to read an article in the newspaper by a serious Buddhist nationalist arguing, for example, that the Norwegian intervention in the peace process proved that actually the whole thing was a kind of Christian conspiracy and that the LTT themselves were just the kind of pawns in a global Christian game of ideological domination. To say this is a kind of counterintuitive reading of what was going on is to put it mildly. But this was the sort of position that many leading Buddhist nationalists were taking by that point. And then in 2009, when the war ended, there was a significant shift of focus away from these Christian groups, although they're still a target of some attack, onto Muslims. Muslims became the new other in a big way. And new kinds of militant Buddhist groups sprung up in the period after the end of the war, of whom the best known is Buddha Balasena, or BBS as they're usually known, but also Sinhala Ravia, and then a group that started to throw its weight around last year, Mahasen Balakia. And the Norwegian researcher, Michael Hertzberg, who was looking in his PhD, 2015 PhD, which was actually about the anti-conversion movement, he was interviewing a number of these leading Buddhist activists. And one of them said to him, basically, Christians are no longer thinking, we've shifted our focus to the Muslims now. It's almost like people have got bored with the anti-Christian rhetoric. We need a new other in order to kind of keep people motivated. So the same time as all this was going on, and this is my final point, is something that's been very, very unnoticed by scholars and mainstream reporters. That received version of the history of everything based on the Mahavamsa, the great chronicle, about how the Buddha came to Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese people came to Sri Lanka from outside with the founding father Vijaya, who landed with his soldiers and married a local woman and so on. And all this story, which is absolutely fundamental to everything we thought we knew about Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, has unravelled for many people. There are new groups now who are obsessed with the figure of Ravana. The Sri Lankan version of Ravana from the Ramayana is one in which Ravana is this heroic local figure. And so you get a new narrative in which the Sinhalese people are not people who've come from outside the Sinhala language, which is an Indo-European language, not a Dravidian language. It doesn't come from North India. It actually comes from Sri Lanka. And Buddhism and the Sinhala people were there in Sri Lanka before the Buddha was. So it's a story about deep, deep autochthony. And that, it's not that everybody buys into this story, but that story is very, very widespread. I went to a major Buddhist cultural centre associated with BBS the year before last and came away with a stack of writings in English. I didn't even get the Sinhala ones, just the ones in English about Ravana. And about this alternative history of Sri Lanka. And for those of you familiar with alternative histories of Sri Lanka's neighbour to the north, of course, you will discover that the light bulb was discovered by Sri Lankans, and refrigerators and nuclear power, and all of these things can be found there in the centuries before the Common Era. Meanwhile, this is a slightly distorted image. I don't know what happened to that in the transmission. Anyway, that's from the cover of our book, Checkpoint, Temple, Church and Mosque. Meanwhile, the Muslims were caught between the two groups during the war. Before the mid-1980s, in the very, very early days in the east and the north, some young Muslim men did sign up with the Tamil militant groups. There was the possibility of a kind of united front against Sinhala domination. But by the mid-80s, that splintered and fractured radically. Partly because the government was making it splinter and fracture, but partly for all sorts of other local reasons. And particularly, the gap between the Muslim community and the LTTE widened. So the Muslim community in the north, about 70,000 people, were expelled overnight by the LTTE in 1990, and still very few of them have come back even now after the end of the war. And in the east of the country, where Muslims and Tamils are in more or less equal proportions in the population, there were attempts at radical ethnic cleansing by the LTTE in the form of massacres of Muslims in different settings. And then there would be counter-massacres of Tamil Hindus in neighbouring villages by paramilitary groups associated with the government. So that early period in the 1990s, the split between Tamils and Muslims became completely terrible. Oh, I should add that the book is based on fieldwork in that area of the East, in the period just at the end of the war, in 2006, 7, 8, and we were looking at the role of religion in the conflict, and then specifically religious organisations. And we thought we'd be looking at, I don't know, religious NGOs or something, but in fact we found that the really key people were people like Catholic priests and the mosque federations and so on. The religious leaders had moved into the vacuum where political leaders might have been in the past, and were very important, particularly in mediating flashpoint situations. So if you know, somebody, take an example from very early in our fieldwork, somebody threw a hand grenade into the mosque in a town in Eastern Province, and it was the Mosque Federation commandeered the microphone and broadcast across the town addresses to the young men telling them not to retaliate, and posted people on the roads around the town to stop young men going out into the villages to do the retaliation that was expected of them. So those sorts of incidents were very, very interesting. And a whole chapter in the book, which is most relevant for the recent developments in Sri Lanka was about conflict within the Muslim community itself. Nationally, the Muslims had, up to that point, up until the early 1980s, had participated in national politics through the medium of the national political parties, the UMP and the SLFP. Both of them had Muslim ministers, Muslim MPs, representing predominantly Muslim constituencies. But I'm going to have to speed up, actually. I'm going to go very, very quickly now, because I just realised it's 10:40 already. The first thing that happened was the formation of a Muslim party, really very much on the model of the dominant Tamil parties at the time, so the Sri Lankan Muslim Congress, formed by this man, Ashraf, who was a very gifted and skillful Muslim politician, and who was killed in, again, murky circumstances, like so many of the circumstances I'm talking about, in 2000 in a helicopter crash. And had Ashraf lived, all sorts of aspects of the history would have been different, I think. As well as the rise of this new political party, we documented the rise of new kinds of community organisation, particularly these mosque federations, where the mosque leaderships united and dealt with the army, they dealt with the paramilitaries, they dealt with the LTT, they dealt with whoever had to be dealt with. But at the same time, and below the radar to some extent, you have, as I think across South Asia and across the Muslim world in general, you have the spread of a whole bunch of different reform movements, Tablighi Jamaat, Jamaat Islam, and these groups that have gone under the generic title of Tawheed, and they're the ones who've been in the headlines this week. But after Ashraf's death in 2000, the SLMC still carries on, it still has a national leadership, but it's very fragmented, and many of the strongest Muslim politicians are effectively parties of one. They are local political bosses based in particular towns and particular areas, who then trade themselves with whoever's in power for positions in government, resources, patronage. I wanted to say a little bit about the town of Katangkudi on the east coast, which is where, in the narrative that emerged on Monday and Tuesday, the mastermind behind the bombing is said to be a man from Katangkudi. I'd already been thinking of Katangkudi in the last month because Katangkudi was the site of one of the worst atrocities of the war. It was the Christchurch shootings that brought it to mind, because in Katangkudi in 1990, the LTT walked into the main mosque on a Friday morning and killed over 100 men and boys who were at prayer that morning. And they've left the mosque, this is a picture taken about 10 years ago, they've left the mosque as it was, every bullet hole is still there. And if you come as a casual visitor to the town of Katangkudi, this is where you will get taken, this is what you will be shown. You will not be allowed to forget it. And as I say, Katangkudi is also the town that seems to have been the birthplace of this group called National Tawheed Jamaat, which when I was putting this together on Wednesday, still seemed to be being held responsible for Sunday's bombing, but by this morning was beginning to be, that narrative was beginning to wobble a little bit. But as well as the attacks that Katangkudi is a Muslim enclave on the east coast. It's a town of about 40,000 people. It's the most densely populated settlement in Sri Lanka. They're absolutely pinned in. On one side is the sea, on another side is the lagoon, and top and bottom are Tamil settlements. Town of Batapalo, where one of the bombs was on Sunday, and then other towns to the south. And as an enclave, it's a very inwardly it's inwardly facing and outwardly facing at the same time. Young men have a long tradition of going off for employment elsewhere and coming back. And in the last 30 years, many of them have gone to the Middle East and come back, which is almost certainly part of the story of the religious changes there. And when we were doing our fieldwork, Katangkudi is the subject of one of the chapters in our book, and this incident is at the centre of it. This is a mosque, a meditation centre that was set up by the followers of a heterodox Sufi called Pailwan, who was a former wrestler, as his name suggests. And when Parwan died in Colombo, he'd been driven out of Katangkudi by his religious opponents, but when he died in Colombo in 2006, his supporters helicoptered his body back to be buried in Katangkudi, which gives you some sense of their kind of wealth and position in the community. And his opponents dug up the body and stole it, because they said, we cannot allow a non-Muslim to be buried here. He was being accused of apostasy. But they also pulled down this tower, this minaret that had been set up with cables. Men with cables did this. And so that was the scene as we found it in 2006. That has been rebuilt subsequently. But it gives, again, a sense of the ferment within the Muslim community. This sort of stuff was completely unknown to people outside the East Coast, outside Katangkudi, outside the Muslim community. Nobody was aware of any of this going on, really. And the group that was responsible for this attack on Parwan is, as far as we can tell, it's basically the same people who then resurfaced under a new name as National Tawhid Jamaat in around 2011 or 2012. And then just to complete the picture before we get to the weekend, Christians. Through the war, so the Christians are less than 10% of the population, but they're fairly prominent, particularly in urban areas. Many are middle class and so on. This is Negumbo, just a Catholic shrine there in the heart of the kind of Catholic belt on the west coast of the country. The war coincided with the emergence of a more activist priesthood from Vatican II onwards, liberation theology, Asian as much as Latin American liberation theology. Some young priests signed up with the Tamil liberation struggle. Others were very prominent in anti-war, cross-ethnic initiatives. And others were very, very tied up with more or less Marxist politics in the South as well. But then from the 70s onwards, you start to get the spread of new Pentecostal churches in the country, recruiting in some part from the old mainstream churches, but also recruiting from Hindu and Buddhist population as well. And these are the ones that the Buddhist nationalists have been most... So then this is the story as we knew it. These are all the things that have been going on over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And then we get to this. We get to last Sunday and the bombs in churches on Easter Monday. And nothing that I've said really explains what happened there. It tells you a little bit. There's a huge amount of energy being gone into kind of putting together narratives and explanations. But there is this sort of terrible non sequitur about that event. At least for me there is. And I think this is something I've been sharing. I mean, I've been in intense communication with friends and colleagues this past week. And it's something I think we all share. It's like, this makes no sense. This is not something that we expected. I had an email exchange with a Sri Lankan Muslim human rights activist who's been researching on Muslim groups. Dr. Farah Mila, who's at the University of Exeter, emailing with her on Monday or Tuesday, and she was beside herself. She said, I've done all this research. Nothing I was doing led me to expect this at all. I had no idea that this was going to happen. And I think that sentiment is something that's being shared by many of us. And I think something very important that we need to kind of hang on to that. Because the rush to explain, the rush to create narratives ex post facto runs the risk of kind of papering over very, very important kind of discontinuities in this history. And I think the discontinuities really are important. The obvious antecedents, yes, there were anti-Christian attacks in Sri Lanka. And that was something that I thought a lot of the mainstream media was a little slow to pick up on. Hundreds of attacks on churches over the last 10 years. This is from the US State Department Religious Freedom Report. Obviously pursues a particular agenda, but the numbers involved are completely plausible. But the thing is, these were attacks by Buddhists on mostly evangelical churches, They were mostly attacks on the property, they weren't attacks on people, they weren't blowing up, they were sometimes burning down. Sometimes people got beaten up, but it was nothing like what we saw at the weekend at all. There were also attacks on Muslims, and growing numbers of attacks on Muslims, most recently in March of last year in Digana, a small town in Kandy district just outside Kandy, prompted by a local dispute, a bunch of Muslim kids, drunken Muslim kids, interestingly enough. A bunch of drunken Muslim kids in one vehicle got into an argument with a truck driver and beat him up, and he died afterwards. And groups like Bodu Balasena moved in immediately to exploit the situation, to whip up tension. And there was this wave of destruction of Muslim property, which shook everybody. A state of emergency was declared. And the first of these shutdowns of social media, because WhatsApp and Facebook were distributing all sorts of stuff that was seemed to be fanning the... So you have attacks on Muslims, but these were attacks again by Buddhist nationalists. And it wasn't Buddhist nationalists, it wasn't Buddhist targets, it wasn't BBS that were attacked on Sunday. So in terms of the logic of the conflict dynamics in Sri Lanka, it doesn't connect at all. Most previous attacks on churches had been on new churches, not on the mainstream ones. So the two West Coast churches that got bombed were the biggest loss of life, were big Catholic churches, very big establishment Catholic churches, not new problematic Pentecostal ones. The church in Bataclan that was attacked was indeed a Pentecostal church, a Church of Zion, but the story that's emerged in the last couple of days is that the bomber actually tried to go to the big Catholic church, which is just up the road in Bataclan, and discovered that the service had finished and people were mostly dispersed. So went down the road to the Pentecostal church, where there were still hundreds of people in the service, and that's where he detonated. So the original attack seemed to have been going for like big, obvious establishment churches. Muslims have been heavily attacked by Buddhist nationalists, but they've not been attacked by Christian groups at all. So there's no prehistory of this at all in Sri Lanka. And Christian churches have both Sinhala and Tamil members. The Bataclan one was predominantly Tamil. The churches in Colombo and Negombo have Sinhala and Tamil parishioners. They happened to be doing the Tamil medium service in the early morning when the bombs went off, so more Tamil people were killed than Sinhalese. But this was not intended particularly as an anti-Tamil attack, this was an anti-Christian attack. There were further complications. You'll all have seen the stories about the intelligence warnings that weren't distributed, and they link everything to this group, National Tawheed Jamaat. They're the ones who are the successors of the people who pulled down the Sufi centre in Katangkudi. And the top picture there is a picture of a protest against them in 2015 in Katangkudi, where if you actually zoom up the picture, you'll see most of the placards are in Tamil, but there's bits in English about demanding that these terrorists be arrested. So these people are actually followers of another Sufi leader from Katangkudi, and who had been attacked by this group, I mean physically attacked by this group. And they are protesting about what they see as the political inability to take action against them. So this is back in 2015. But this is a dispute that's happening entirely within the Muslim community. This is not a dispute involving other religious communities at all. These people are playing their game in this kind of closed world of intra-Muslim politics and dynamics. So NTJ comes up in this intelligence briefing as the group behind it, and the leader of NTJ, a man called Zaran, is named as the ringleader. Now, as the week has gone on, it's become increasingly unclear to me, at least, what role this guy actually played in it. Although a lot of the discussion has been taking for granted that this is what happened. We don't really know, and the identities of the other bombers that have now begun to seep out one way and another, sons of a rich Colombo businessman and stuff like that, suggest a completely different social background to these people from Katangkudi. So the story is obviously a great deal more complicated than the one that was put together very early on. Again, you'll probably have noticed that the Prime Minister and indeed the Army have both said that this intelligence briefing, this warning about attacks on churches, was never passed on to them. The Prime Minister and the President are in a well-publicised feud and standoff, particularly since the President tried to sack the Prime Minister in October of last year and failed. On Wednesday, we got the statement from ISIS claiming responsibility. And indeed, by now, by this point in the week, it seems to me that we've got too much information, but very little sense of what of this information we can believe and what we can't believe. Okay? Some things we do know. The point that I've been making, the antecedents don't seem to explain anything, that there is something radically new about this, and this is perhaps where W.B. Yeats could come in. All is changed utterly. We have never seen anything like this. The political imagination that informs these acts is qualitatively different from anything that has been informing other acts of violence in Sri Lanka over the last 30 or 40 years. They don't make sense in terms of what we know about the dynamics of conflict in Sri Lanka. And in that respect, I don't think they're particularly actions addressed to a Sri Lankan audience. The Sri Lankan audience is kind of bystanders. This is talking to someone else out there, some other entity. The ISIS claims, as I think many of you will recognise, are not an explanation of anything. The minute that comes up, you have to start asking all sorts of questions like, what does this actually mean? Is this an ex post facto claim that they want to badge this thing as theirs? Does it mean that there's actually formal organisational connections? Or is it, as seems to me most likely, that these young men had put themselves in some kind of ISIS-like political universe? That's where they thought they were operating now. But there is also chances that there are links through people going to fight in Syria and coming back and stuff like that. And one hopes that there will be clearer information on all of this as it comes out. The political divisions, there's the lovely picture of a happy president and prime minister cohabiting comfortably, as you can see. The political divisions make all official information increasingly unreliable. In fact, it's been unbelievable, the kind of gabbiness of the cabinet members. There are, by the way, something like 100 cabinet members, and every one of them claims to know something that nobody else does in order to get somebody's attention. So all sorts of sense and nonsense has been disseminated in the name of the government with no central kind of control over the flow of information at all. And as I said, this is my other really key point. What's happened before doesn't explain what happened in the atrocity itself. Those political dynamics are going to be what shapes what happens afterwards in Sri Lanka. The authoritarian elements waiting in the wings have just been dying for something like this to happen in order to justify increased clampdown on Buddhists, on Muslims and other minorities, increased authoritarian powers to the security forces, and so on and so forth. We can see the way the story is most likely going to go, even if we can't see how that story led to what happened. And I think, again, for me, it seems to be very important to acknowledge the limits of what we know at this point, to acknowledge that. There's a tweet from Meera Srinivasan. Some of you may know Meera, who's a really wonderful journalist. She's probably the best non-Sri Lankan journalist reporting on the conflict at the moment. And in her tweet, this was actually on Sunday itself, when somebody had come out with some story explaining everything, and she said, there is no joy in getting this story first. We need to get it right. And so she and some of the other local Sri Lankan journalists have been really, really brilliant in terms of trying to not rush into ISIS stories, other kinds of stories. But the Indian press, in stark contrast, has been dreadful, I think, apart from the Hindu, universally dreadful. The press in Europe and the United States started bad but has got a lot better as the dust has settled, and as this kind of caution is starting to go. If you want to get information on what has happened, I listed 3 places you can go. One is Ground Views, the civil society website run from Sri Lanka itself, which, as well as its own articles on what's happened, has been curating 4 lists on Twitter, journalists, civil society activists, retweeting stuff that they thought was particularly useful, and I found that very useful this week. There's an excellent piece by Alan Keenan, who I mentioned at the start of the presentation, on the International Crisis Group blog, which you can find there, which is the best analysis of what's happening. And Alan really knows what he's talking about in terms of this particular story. And there's Mira's work in The Hindu and her tweets on Twitter, which, again, everything that I've seen from her has been impeccable, as one might expect. On Sunday, I saw on Facebook just an hour or 2 after the bomb went, this verse from Newman posted it on it. He's a Facebook friend of mine, who poem about the Buddha we had earlier. And I don't read Tamil, but I did a Facebook translate. I think I need to get a better version. So I sent it to, if you want a Tamil translation, you send it to David Shulman, the greatest Tamil scholar in the world. And David translated it. I sent it back to Newman. Newman was a little nonplussed. He said, actually, that wasn't a poem. I just said what I was thinking. And I said, well, I think at your age you've got to a point where everything you say is a poem, even when you're not trying. So Newman's immediate reaction as a Muslim, as a man who has observed and intervened in his quiet way over the years of conflict in all sorts of wonderful ways, his immediate reaction was, I'm frozen solid, I'm mute, I just don't know what to do. But I don't want to just leave you with that somber note. I'm going to finish actually with something a little bit different. And this has been a week of, obsessive emailing and checking social media and speaking to friends and so on. And this is just something that came from another friend of mine, Darshan Ambalabana. Some of you may know Darshan as the moving force behind the Tamil Studies Conference in Toronto in its glory days of the early 2000s. And Darshan is now a Christian social worker in Bataclan, where the bomb went off. And this is just something he circulated to friends on yesterday morning, in fact, about what was happening in Bataclan. And it's about how the church leaders in the Malavis had been getting together, various things they've been doing in order to try to keep the lid on any situation escalating. And there are other equally wonderful things that have been coming around from people in places like Bati. I'm just leaving that there to remind you of the work that people are putting in to try and stop this story. Sorry.